The bank in Harbor Peak smelled of stale cigar smoke desperation, and the fine red dust that coated everything in the Montana Territory. It was a smell Greta Winslow had come to associate with endings. She stood before the teller's cage, her spine straight, her gloved hands clasped tightly around the small velvet pouch in her reticule. Inside was the last of her money, a sum so meager it felt like an insult to the life she had once known. Beside it lay her husband's silver pocket watch, its familiar weight a cold comfort against her palm. "I'd like to withdraw the full balance, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her heart. The teller, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, peered at her over his spectacles. "The full balance, Mrs. Winslow. Are you certain it won't last you the week?" "I am aware of my circumstances," Greta replied, the words tasting like ash. The entire town was aware of her circumstances. The Baroness widow, they called her, whose husband Nathaniel had gambled and drank his way through a sizable inheritance, leaving behind nothing but debts and whispers about the wife who had failed to provide him an heir. As Mr. Abernathy reluctantly began to count out the coins, the cheerful jingle of the bell above the bank's door was replaced by the violent slam of wood against wood. Two men burst in their faces, obscured by dusty bandanas. The taller of the two brandished a shotgun, its twin barrels sweeping across the room with practiced menace, while the other, a man with a raw, puckered scar bisecting his left eyebrow, moved with a predator's coiled silence. "Nobody move the man with the shotgun," barked his voice, a gravelly command that froze the half-dozen patrons in place. Greta's blood ran cold. Her first instinct was to shield her small purse not for the money, but for the watch. It was all she had left of the man she had once loved, before bitterness had corroded him from the inside out. The scarred man's eyes, cold and dark, as a winter river swept the room and landed on her. He moved toward her, ignoring the teller who was frantically shoving money into a canvas sack. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the sweat and leather on him. He didn't reach for the money in her reticule. Instead, his gaze fixed on the faint bulge of the pocket watch. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and plucked the reticule from her grasp. He opened it, tipped the paltry coins onto the floor where they scattered with a pathetic clatter, and then closed his fingers around the silver watch. He held it up the light, catching the intricate engraving on its case. A cruel smile twisted his lips beneath the bandana. He pocketed the watch and with a final dismissive glance turned his back on her. The robbery was over in less than a minute. The men vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a terrified silence and the lingering smell of gunpowder. Greta remained frozen, staring at the spot where the watch had been. The loss felt more profound than the theft of $1,000. It was a violation, a severing of her last tangible link to a past that was already fading into a painful memory. The aftermath was a blur of concerned-sounding platitudes and barely concealed contempt. Marshal Pikeford, a man whose weary posture suggested he was fighting a losing battle against the territory's lawlessness, took her statement on the bank steps. As he scribbled in his notebook, Tobias Crane and Celine Harrow approached their expressions, a perfect tableau of condescending sympathy. Crane, Harbor Peak's wealthiest and most influential landowner, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his movements precise and reptilian. A terrible ordeal, Margaret. Simply terrible. One has to wonder what brings such trouble to our quiet little town. Celine Harrow, the owner of the town's only boarding house and its chief purveyor of gossip, fanned herself with a lace-trimmed fan, though the morning air was still cool. It's a shame, truly. But then some people are magnets for misfortune, she said, her eyes flicking over Greta's worn black dress. The comment, delivered with a sly, knowing look at Crane, was not a general observation. It was an arrow aimed directly at Greta's heart. Greta felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting the Marshal's. "Is there anything else you require, Marshal?" Pikeford sighed, snapping his notebook shut. No, ma'am. Not for now. He knew as well as she did that the watch was gone forever, another piece of flotsam swallowed by the vast, indifferent frontier. The incident at the bank cemented her fate. That evening, at Celine Harrow's boarding house, what began as idle gossip over dinner escalated into sport. Fueled by whiskey and a sense of his own importance, Tobias Crane slammed his fist on the table, silencing the room. That woman has been nothing but a burden since Nathaniel died, he declared, his face flushed. She's a drain on this community. I wager even that brute Deacon Holt wouldn't take her on as helpless as she is. The challenge hung in the air, a cruel joke that quickly took on a life of its own. By the time Marshal Pikeford arrived at Greta's rented room the next morning with a wagon, the joke had become her reality. They were sending her to Holt's isolated ranch as a paid servant, a test of endurance no one in Harbor Peak expected her to pass. It was a convenient and cruel solution to the problem of the Baroness' widow. The journey stretched for hours across a vast, open prairie that shimmered under a sun that bleached the very color from the sky. The marshal's silence was punctuated only by occasional terse warnings about the man who would be her new employer. Lost his wife and child to fever 3 winters back. Pikeford grunted, not looking at her. Hasn't spoken more than 10 words together since. Don't expect kindness, Mrs. Winslow. Just work until your hands bleed. When Deacon Holt's property finally appeared on the horizon, it looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the wilderness. A sturdy 2-story cabin, its logs weathered to a silver gray, was flanked by a barn and a collection of outbuildings that leaned as if weary from their long battle with the wind. The land around it was scarred with irrigation trenches, a testament to one man's relentless war against the cracked earth, so thirsty for a rain that never came. A solitary figure watched their approach from the porch, his face shadowed beneath a worn hat, his stance as unyielding as iron. As the wagon creaked to a stop, kicking up a cloud of red dust, Greta gathered the frayed edges of her courage. She would not show weakness. Not to the marshal, not to the town that had cast her out, and certainly not to the silent man who was now her keeper. I'll manage, she said simply, her voice carrying on the dry breeze. She stepped down from the wagon without assistance, her plain black dress billowing around ankles, already coated in the dust of what would become either her prison or her salvation. Deacon Holt turned without a word, a silent command for her to follow as he strode toward the main house. His shoulders, broad as an ox yoke, carried a tension that spoke of a man long unused to company. The cabin, though weathered, showed signs of meticulous, if joyless, care. Split wood was stacked in precise geometric chords. Tools hung in perfect alignment on the wall of a lean-to. It was the order of a man trying to impose control on a world that had spun out of it. Your quarters are through there. He finally spoke, his voice rough and gravelly from disuse. He pointed to a small door off the main kitchen. Breakfast at dawn, dinner at dusk. I work the north fields until midday, then the livestock. Laundry's piled by the washboard. Water needs hauling from the well daily. He paused, his gaze fixed somewhere over her left shoulder. Questions. His eyes never met hers. It was a dismissal more profound than any harsh word. Greta surveyed the space that was now her domain, a Spartan kitchen with a large iron stove, a worn wooden table, and shelves of preserved goods that spoke of grim practicality. The floors had been swept, but dust clung to the window frames, and cobwebs decorated the ceiling corners like funeral lace evidence that a woman's touch had long been absent. She would not be cowed. Removing her shawl with steady hands, she faced him, her voice betraying none of the terror that fluttered in her chest. I need to know the boundaries of your property and which vegetables grow best in this soil. I'll start a kitchen garden tomorrow. For the first time, a flicker of something surprised perhaps crossed his face. His eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. Garden plots east of the house. Carrots, potatoes do well. Tomatoes struggle. He moved toward the back door, then paused as if remembering a forgotten shore. Creek marks the south boundary. Don't go beyond the ridge to the north. Ridge is theirs. Nakoa's people hunt there. The name caught her attention. Nakoa, you have neighbors then. The prospect of another human soul within riding distance offered a sliver of comfort against the crushing weight of the isolation. He trades here. Twice monthly. Brings game, takes supplies to his family. Deacon's hand was on the door latch, eager to escape this unwanted intrusion into his solitary world. He added almost as an afterthought, wolves been spotted near the east pasture. Don't wander after dusk. The warning carried no warmth, merely a piece of practical information delivered as one might discuss the weather. In her small room, a narrow bed with faded linens, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a single hook for her spare dress, Greta unpacked her few belongings. She placed her mother's tattered Bible on the nightstand, the only remnant of her own past. The space where her husband's watch should have been was a hollow ache. That night, sleep was a skittish visitor. The prairie wind whistled through every crack in the weathered walls, a persistent, mournful song. Distant coyotes sang their eerie chorus to a sliver of moon, and the occasional creak of floorboards from the room above reminded her she was not alone. But a restless, solitary presence moved above her, as haunted as the house itself. Dawn arrived with brutal efficiency, painting the horizon in violent streaks of orange and purple. Greta had been awake for hours, fueled by a grim determination to prove her worth. When Deacon descended the stairs, the aroma of hot coffee, frying bacon, and browning biscuits met him. He paused at the bottom step, momentarily disconcerted. His kitchen had been transformed. The table was scrubbed to reveal a grain long hidden beneath grime. The windows wiped clear of dust, and in the center of the table sat a small jar of wildflowers, purple clover and yellow mustard, a defiant splash of color in the monochrome world. Greta served his plate without a word, then filled her own with a smaller portion. They ate in a silence thick with unspoken thoughts, the scrape of forks against plates at the only conversation. When he finished, he pushed his chair back, stood and gave a single sharp nod, the barest acknowledgement of her labor. He took his hat and rifle from the pegs by the door and disappeared into the awakening landscape, left alone. Greta attacked the day's chores with a fury. She hauled water from the well until her arms trembled and her back ached. She scrubbed shirts stiff with sweat and dried mud, her own dress soon damp with exertion. No matter the discomfort, she would not allow the gossips of Harbor Peak to be proven right. By midday, she had cleared the corner of land Deacon had indicated for her garden. The unforgiving soil was better than she'd expected, dark and rich beneath a tangle of stubborn weeds. Her palms, soft from a life of domesticity, were already blistered and raw. A movement at the edge of the property caught her eye. A rider approached, not with the hurried gait of a man with business, but with a slow, deliberate pace. His posture was proud, his path careful. Greta straightened, wiping soil from her hands onto her apron. This must be the man Deacon had called Nakoa. He was a man who seemed to have grown from the earth itself. His features were strong, weathered by sun and wind, into a mask of quiet dignity. Intricate beadwork in vibrant blues and reds adorned his leather vest, and a single eagle feather was tied into his long dark hair. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his dark eyes assessing her with an intelligent curiosity that held no judgment. "You are new," he stated. It was not a question. "I am Greta Winslow," she replied, finding an unexpected strength in speaking her full name after days of being just the woman. "Mr. Holt is in the North Fields." He nodded his gaze, taking in her blistered hands and the freshly cleared garden plot. The spirits move in unexpected ways. "Deacon Holt speaks to few invites, none." "I wasn't invited," Greta admitted, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. In this man's steady presence, pretense felt foolish. "I was sent. But I intend to earn my keep." Nakoa unstrapped a bundle from his saddle. It was fresh venison, wrapped carefully in broad leaves. The first hunt of spring, he explained, offering it to her without ceremony. Your garden will need time. This will sustain you. His generosity was practical. A simple acknowledgement of the challenges she faced, offered without a hint of pity. Before Greta could properly thank him, Deacon's tall figure appeared on the ridge, his rifle balanced in the crook of his arm. He surveyed the scene, Greta, in her half-tilled garden Nakoa, by the hitching post, and approached with long, measured strides. The two men exchanged a nod, a wordless communication born of long acquaintance. Creeks are running high, Deacon said, his version of a greeting. Southern fence will need reinforcing before the melt floods the lower pasture. His eyes flicked briefly to Greta, then back to Nakoa. You've met Mrs. Winslow. The formal introduction was an admission, however belated, that she was a presence to be acknowledged. Nakoa's perceptive gaze moved between them, reading currents invisible to Greta. I have brought meat and news. Judge Malloran rides the circuit next moon. He brings mail and supplies. He paused, his expression growing serious. Crane's men push their cattle across the eastern borders. They take water rights by force where papers fail. At the mention of Tobias Crane, Deacon's jaw tightened. It was the first raw, unguarded emotion Greta had seen from him. Man's greed knows no bounds. He muttered, his hand absently checking the action of his rifle. Been cutting my fence lines, too. Found 3 breaks last week. That evening, the hearty venison stew Greta prepared passed in their familiar silence. But the atmosphere had changed. The indifference had been replaced by a shared tension. Deacon's thoughts were clearly troubled by Nakoa's news. When his spoon finally scraped against his empty bowl, he looked up, meeting Greta's eyes directly for the first time since her arrival. Stew was good, he said. The compliment was awkward but genuine. It was a beginning. The next morning brought a late spring storm, and the sky turning a bruised, ominous gray. Deacon departed earlier than usual to secure the livestock, leaving Greta to battle the drafts that whistled through the cabin's aging chinks. Using old newspapers she found tucked in a corner, she methodically began sealing the gaps. By midday, rain lashed against the windows, drumming on the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Trapped inside, Greta turned her attention to long-neglected repairs, mending chair cushions and replacing a broken cabinet hinge. In the back of a storage closet, half hidden beneath a pile of worn blankets, she discovered a small, cedar-lined trunk. Hesitantly, she lifted the lid. Inside lay a woman's things, preserved like pressed flowers in a book. A silver-backed hairbrush with strands of auburn hair still tangled in its bristles. A faded daguerreotype of a smiling young woman holding a swaddled infant. A pair of tiny, perfectly knitted booties. Deacon's lost world. The ghost of his family lingered in every corner of the cabin, in the empty rocking chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, in the profound silence where laughter should have echoed. Respectfully, Greta closed the trunk, a deep ache of empathy settling in her chest. She now understood the true depth of his silence. It wasn't just solitude, it was a fortress built around a hollowed-out heart. When Deacon finally returned, drenched and mud-splattered, he found the cabin transformed. Not just clean, but mended. The drafts were silenced, a hot meal waited on the stove, and Greta asked no questions about his prolonged absence. She simply handed him a dry towel. Her quiet competence was a balm he hadn't known he needed. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them in a proximity that should have bred contempt, but instead fostered a tentative understanding. Greta learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, in the rhythm of his bootsteps on the porch. On the 4th morning, watery sunshine filtered through dissipating clouds, revealing a world washed clean. While assessing the storm's damage, Deacon discovered that the creek had carved a new channel through the south meadow. The news seemed to trouble him more than the downed fences or the splintered chicken coop. That afternoon, as Greta was scrubbing the abandoned smokehouse, humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing, she found a small locked box tucked away on a high shelf, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was out of place amongst the curing hooks and salt bins. Her curiosity piqued. She worked the rusty lock with a piece of wire until it sprang open. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs, was a leather-bound journal and a folded yellow deed. The journal belonged to Deacon's late wife, Eliza. Her elegant script filled the pages with observations about the land recipes and tender words about her husband and son. Tucked into the last few pages was a story that made Greta's breath catch in her throat. Eliza wrote of a night years ago when Deacon's father, a stoic and righteous man, had played cards with a visiting land speculator named Alistair Crane. Crane Tobias's father had been arrogant and boastful, wagering his entire neighboring parcel of land in the very land Tobias now owned on a final hand. He lost. Eliza wrote that Alistair Crane had left in a fury, accusing Deacon's father of cheating, swearing a vow of revenge that would follow his family for generations. Beneath the journal was the old deed. It wasn't for Deacon's land, but for the adjacent properties signed over by Alistair Crane to Elias Holt. A note in Elias's rough hand was attached, one fair and square. But the man's pride is a dangerous thing. Best to keep this quiet. Deacon's father had never registered the deed, choosing peace over property. Greta stared at the documents, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Tobias Crane's aggression wasn't just about water rights or simple greed. It was a deeply personal vendetta, a festering wound passed from father to son. He wasn't trying to acquire land. He was trying to reclaim a legacy he believed was stolen to avenge his family's ruin. The conflict was no longer about property. It was about blood. A week later, Burke Malloran, the circuit judge, arrived 2 weeks ahead of schedule, his entourage churning the muddy yard. The storm had washed out the northern route, forcing a change in his circuit. His keen eyes took in Greta's work-worn appearance and the transformed cabin with open interest. Marshal Pikeford, accompanying him, seemed equally astonished to find her not just surviving, but thriving. "We bring news and mail," Malloran announced over coffee, "and a matter requiring official attention." He produced a folded document. Tobias Crane has filed a formal complaint concerning water rights to Clear Creek. He claims the storm altered the creek's path, putting it on contested land. Deacon's knuckles whitened around his mug. "My deed is clear. The creek cuts through my property, has since my father's time." "Indeed," Malloran agreed. "Which is why I've come personally." Legal matters aside, he continued, his tone shifting. There are rumors circulating in Harbor Peak about your arrangement here. Mrs. Harrow has been particularly vocal about the propriety of a widow residing alone with an unmarried man. Heat rushed to Greta's cheeks, a flare of pure indignation. The same town that wagered on my failure now concerns itself with my virtue. A surprised chuckle escaped the judge. "Quite so, Mrs. Winslow. However, perception often outweighs reality. This could complicate your dispute if Crane decides to use it against your character in court." Before Deacon could respond, and the sound of a horse being pushed beyond its limits tore through the quiet afternoon. A frantic gallop grew louder until a young woman on a foam-flecked horse skidded to a stop in the yard. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and she clutched a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. "Help!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Please help us." Marshal Pikeford reached her just as her legs buckled. The bundle in her arms emitted a weak whimpering cry. It was a child, a boy no more than 2, his face pale and feverish. "Renegades," the woman gasped, swaying on her feet. "Attacked our wagon, killed my husband. Been running 2 days." Greta moved with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. She took the child from the woman's arms as Judge Malloran supported the collapsing mother. The boy's skin burned against her hands. "He needs medicine," she said sharply, a maternal authority overtaking her. and clean water. Quickly inside, the chaos of their arrival yielded to a focused purpose. The woman Sarah Billings collapsed into an exhausted sleep while Greta battled for her son's life. She applied cool compresses and coaxed willow bark tea between his cracked lips, humming the same lullaby she'd sung in the smokehouse. Deacon hovered at the periphery, his usual stoicism replaced by a quiet vigilance. He carried water-split kindling and even fashioned a small wooden cup more suitable for a child's mouth. His large hands, accustomed to breaking horses, moved with a surprising gentleness. The boy's fever broke near midnight. "He'll live," Greta murmured, sinking into a chair, the exhaustion of the vigil washing over her. Deacon stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel, and for the first time, she felt his presence not as an intrusion, but as a comfort. The following day brought a crueler turn. Sarah's injury, a wound in her side she had hastily bound, had festered. By noon she was burning with an infection that no frontier remedy could touch. In a moment of chilling lucidity, she clutched Greta's hand, her eyes fever-bright, but intensely focused. "Promise me," she gasped, her fingers digging into Greta's palm. "Promise you'll care for Levi. Don't let him go to strangers. He's a good boy. Clever. Strong." Greta felt Deacon's presence behind her, solid as the mountains. "I promise," she whispered, the weight of the vow settling over her like a physical mantle. A shuddering sigh of relief escaped Sarah's lips, and she surrendered to the darkness. They buried her at dawn on a gentle rise overlooking the eastern pasture. Deacon crafted a simple wooden marker, carving her name next to two smaller weathered crosses that marked the graves of his own lost family. Little Levi watched, clinging to Greta's skirts, too young to comprehend death, but old enough to sense its terrible permanence. "I'll file the temporary guardianship papers when I return to the territorial offices," Judge Malloran promised. Before he departed, his demeanor softened by the tragedy. Given the mother's dying request, there should be no complications. But Marshal Pikeford was less certain. "Tobias Crane has considerable influence," he warned in a low voice. "If he decides to make trouble over this." Alone with the child, Greta and Deacon faced a future that had been irrevocably altered. "I won't send him away," Greta stated, her voice quiet but resolute. "I gave my word." Deacon's gaze traveled from her determined face to the window, where the rising sun painted the mountains in hues of promise and sorrow. "A boy needs stability," he said finally, "and safety. He can have that here." The following weeks demanded a new rhythm. Levi's nighttime cries for his mother were a raw, tearing sound that broke Greta's heart anew each night. She would rock him in the chair Deacon had brought down from the attic, Eliza's chair, though neither of them spoke its name. Deacon adapted in his own way, leaving a small, smoothly sanded wooden horse on the table one morning without comment, his eyes tracking Levi's delighted discovery. One afternoon, Nakoa arrived with the mail, his expression grave. "Crane's men speak loudly in town," he warned. "They say the child belongs in proper care, not with—" He trailed off, letting the insult hang unspoken. The official-looking envelope contained a petition to review the guardianship filed by Crane. It claimed they were morally unsuitable, living in sin, and that the circumstances of Sarah Billings's death were questionable. The paper crumpled in Deacon's fist. That night, after Levi slept, the unspoken became spoken. Crane wants leverage for the water rights. Deacon paced a caged wolf in his own kitchen. He's using the boy as a pawn. "We could marry," Greta suggested, the practical solution falling from her lips before she had fully considered its weight. The pacing stopped. Silence crashed down between them. "For Levi's sake," she added hastily, "to protect the guardianship." Deacon's face was unreadable in the lamplight. "Marriage is meant to be more than convenience. So is family," Greta countered softly, surprising herself with her own conviction. Yet here we are, creating one from broken pieces. Sometimes life's blessings arrive through unexpected doors. Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them, too many for a casual visitor. Flickering torchlight appeared at the edge of the property. Ryder's Deacon said grimly, his hand already on his rifle. At least 6. Get Levi. Hide in the root cellar. Trap doors beneath the pantry rug. His eyes met hers, and in that brief glance she saw a fierce resolve that spoke more than words ever could. From the cool, earthy dark of the cellar, Greta clutched the sleeping child as rough voices carried through the night. Halt. We know you're in there. The town's got questions about that orphan boy. Tobias Crane's distinctive cultured voice cut through the drunken shouts of his men. Just a neighborly visit, Holt. The town is concerned. Orphans belong in proper institutions, not isolated ranches with questionable arrangements. Judge Malloran granted temporary guardianship. Deacon's voice was calm, but edged with steel. It's legal and binding. The boy stays here. Temporary is the operative word. Crane countered his tone slick with false reason. The Territorial Orphan Authority has been notified. They'll want to place the child with a proper family. A woman who couldn't bear her own children and a recluse with a reputation for violence hardly meet their standards. The cruelty of his words, designed to wound and humiliate, echoed down into the cellar. Greta felt a stab of old pain, but as she pressed her palm against Levi's small, steadily breathing back, the sting lessened. She was no longer just the Baroness' widow. She was Levi's protector. Just as the tension outside reached a breaking point, a lone rider approached from the east. Nakoa. Trouble rides late tonight, he observed, his calm voice carrying across the yard, and speaks with a forked tongue. Crane's confidence faltered. Nakoa was a respected neutral party, a witness to Sarah's dying wish. Just ensuring the territory's laws are followed ironclad. Crane backpedaled, his attempt at intimidation thwarted. He and his men retreated into the darkness. As their torches dwindled to fireflies in the distance, Deacon turned to Nakoa. Your timing has the spirit's blessing. The town speaks poison about what grows here. Nakoa said, his gaze taking in the quiet order of the ranch. They fear what they do not understand. The official summons arrived a week later, delivered by a weary Marshal Pikeford. A formal hearing was set for the following Tuesday in Harbor Peak. Territorial Orphan Authority officially filed the challenge, Pikeford explained, unable to meet their eyes. Though Crane's cousin initiated it. They've got witnesses prepared to testify. Celine Harrow, mainly. That night, the marriage proposal was revisited, stripped of its haste and panic. They will take him from us, Greta said, voicing their shared fear unless we give them no legal ground to stand on. Deacon traced the grain of the wooden table. Marriage, he asked, the word carefully neutral. For Levi's sake. But this time there was a question in his eyes that went deeper. Not just for Levi, Greta admitted the truth, a quiet revelation. This place, it has become my home. I've found a purpose here. With you. With him. A long silence stretched between them. It wouldn't be fair to you, Deacon finally said, his voice rough. A real husband. A woman like you deserves children of her own. I can't have children. Greta stated plainly, the secret she had guarded for years laid bare on the kitchen table. Nathaniel knew before we married. It's why he sought comfort elsewhere. The admission came without bitterness, a simple, painful fact. Understanding dawned in Deacon's eyes, not pity, but a profound recognition, one scarred soul acknowledging another's wounds. Then we face the judge as a united front, he said with quiet resolve. The marshal can marry us before the hearing. We'll give Crane nothing to use against us. The short ceremony in Marshal Pikeford's office, with Judge Malloran presiding, was stark and simple. Yet, as Deacon slid the plain gold band onto her finger, it felt more real, more binding than the lavish wedding of her youth. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by circumstance. They were a family forged in shared adversity. Nakoa arrived just as they signed the certificate, his presence a silent blessing. The initial hearing was a brutal affair. Crane's lawyer painted them as unstable opportunists. Celine Harrow took the stand and with relish recounted every piece of malicious gossip ever whispered about the Baroness widow. Through it all, Greta and Deacon sat together, their hands clasped, a silent, unbreachable fortress. But it was Levi who turned the tide. When the judge, in a moment of unconventional wisdom, called the small boy forward, Levi walked to the bench with a solemn dignity. "Levi," the judge asked gently, "are you happy living with Mr. and Mrs. Holt?" Levi nodded, and then removed his thumb from his mouth to speak with surprising clarity. "Mama Greta makes good biscuits. Papa Deacon fixed my horse." He held up the wooden toy. The simple, heartfelt testimony did what no legal argument could. Judge Malloran granted them continued temporary guardianship, but the victory was incomplete. "This court will reconvene in 1 month for a final review," he declared, his gaze stern. "I expect a full report from a territorial agent on the suitability of the home environment." It was a reprieve, not a resolution. It gave Crane another month to scheme. They returned to the ranch, the legal battle looming over them. The fragile peace they had built was now a countdown. They worked side by side, preparing for the agent's visit, their shared purpose drawing them closer. The unspoken affection between them grew nurtured by small gestures, a shared smile over Levi's antics, a lingering touch as they passed in the narrow hallway, the comfortable silence as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. They were building a life, not just a legal defense. The day the sandstorm began, the sky turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind rose from a whisper to a mournful howl, carrying with it a fine, stinging grit that found its way through every crack. "Bad one coming." Deacon set his face grim as he scanned the horizon. A real blow. They secured the livestock and battened down the house, working with a practiced efficiency. As the light failed and the world outside dissolved into a swirling vortex of sand and fury, they retreated into the sturdy cabin. The wind shrieked a physical assault on the house, which groaned and shuddered in protest. Through the maelstrom, another sound emerged, hoofbeats muffled by the storm. Deacon grabbed his rifle, his body instantly tense. Through the dust-streaked window, they saw them, 3 riders hunched low against the wind, materializing like phantoms out of the storm. It was Tobias Crane and 2 other men, their faces grim and set. These were not the drunken louts from before. These were hard men, killers for hire. "He's lost," Greta whispered, her heart pounding. "He knows the agent will side with us. He's come to finish it. Get Levi to the root cellar." Deacon commanded, his voice a low growl. "Bar the door. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." Greta scooped up a frightened Levi and ran the floorboards, vibrating with the force of the front door being kicked in. She scrambled into the cellar, shot the heavy bolt, and huddled in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the fight above, a crash, a shout, the deafening roar of Deacon's rifle. The storm howled, mirroring the violence in the house. Then a new sound, the crackle of fire, and the acrid smell of smoke seeping through the floorboards. Crane was burning them out, using the storm as cover. Panic seized her. They would be trapped, roasted alive. Suddenly, the cellar door rattled. A man's voice, not Deacon's, called down. "Come on out, little lady. Your man's down. Don't make it harder on yourself." Greta's blood turned to ice. She looked at Levi, his small face illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. From above, his eyes wide with terror. Her promise to Sarah echoed in her ears. A fierce, primal resolve surged through her. She would not let this child die. She noticed the small ventilation shaft in the far corner of the cellar, a narrow opening to the outside, just large enough for a child. It was their only hope. "Levi, you must be brave," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You have to crawl through here. Run to the creek and hide. Don't look back." As she pushed the sobbing child toward the opening, The cellar door splintered under the force of an axe. The man who kicked it open stood silhouetted against the flames. His face was grimed with soot, but she saw it clearly, the puckered scar bisecting his left eyebrow. It was the man from the bank. The man who had stolen her husband's watch. He lunged for her, but Greta was ready. She swung a heavy cast-iron skillet she had grabbed from a shelf, connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He staggered back, stunned, giving her the precious seconds she needed. She scrambled up the broken stairs and into a vision of hell. The main room was an inferno. Deacon was on the floor, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, struggling to rise. Tobias Crane stood over him, a pistol in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "It's over," Holt Crane said, his voice laced with generations of hate. "My father's land will be cleansed of your name. This storm will be blamed for everything." A tragic accident. As Crane raised his pistol, Greta acted. She grabbed the heavy oil lamp from the mantelpiece, the one thing not yet on fire, and hurled it. It shattered against the wall behind Crane, splashing flaming oil onto his expensive coat. He screamed, dropping the pistol to beat at the flames that engulfed him. The scarred man, recovered from the blow, came at her again. But Deacon, with a final desperate surge of strength, had reached his fallen rifle. A single shot echoed above the roar of the fire and the storm. The man collapsed. Deacon struggled to his feet, grabbing Greta's arm. "The back way, go." They staggered out into the blinding sandstorm, just as the roof of the cabin gave way, with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks into the maelstrom. They collapsed near the creek, finding Levi huddled and terrified, but safe beneath an overhang. As the storm began to subside, its fury spent, they watched the last of their home burn, 3 survivors clinging to each other in the ruin. Marshal Pikeford and a posse arrived at dawn, drawn by the column of smoke visible for miles. The scene told its own story, the burned-out shell of the cabin. And the bodies of Crane and his hired gun Deacon's wound, the terror still etched on Greta's face. The evidence of Crane's final desperate act was undeniable. The town's reaction was not a sudden collective change of heart, but a slow, dawning shame. Faced with the stark reality of Crane's villainy and the quiet dignity of the family he had tried to destroy, the whispers and judgments died. The first sign came 2 days later. Selene Harrow arrived in a buckboard, her face set in an expression of grim determination. She didn't offer apologies or empty words. She unloaded baskets of food, blankets, and medical supplies. "A body needs to eat," she said brusquely, avoiding Greta's eyes, and drove away. It was an act of practical penance, and it spoke louder than any apology. They spent the summer rebuilding. Nakoa and his people came helping to raise the frame of a new, larger house on the ashes of the old. Townsfolk who had once shunned them now appeared with offerings of lumber nails and labor. They were rebuilding more than a house. They were rebuilding a community around the family they had once tried to cast out. Months later, as the first chill of autumn settled over the valley, Nakoa arrived for his regular visit. After they had traded goods and news, he reached into his saddlebag. "I have a gift," he said, and placed something heavy and metallic in Greta's hand. It was her husband's silver pocket watch. The case was tarnished, the crystal cracked, but it was unmistakably hers. A trader in the Northern Territory had it, Nakoa explained. He bought it from a man with a fresh scar on his face, a man who was later captured and confessed to many crimes, including a bank robbery in Harbor Peak. Greta stared at the watch, this ghost from a former life. The pain she once associated with it was gone, replaced by a sense of a circle closing. That evening, Deacon took the watch from her and placed it on the mantel of their new fireplace. He set it next to a small silver locket that had belonged to Eliza. The 2 objects sat side by side, symbols of pasts that were not forgotten, but honored as the foundations of a new shared future. He then took Greta's hand in his calloused fingers lacing through hers, and for the first time, their union felt born not of necessity, but of a deep and abiding love. The winter mail brought a final surprise. A thick envelope from the territorial capital held 2 documents. The first finalized the adoption legally and forever, making him Levi Holt. The second was a letter from Judge Malloran. In it, he offered Deacon a position as a territorial representative for their district. The territory needs men of integrity and unshakable character, the judge had written. Men who know the value of the law because they have seen the cost of lawlessness. Men who build rather than destroy. Standing on the porch of their new home with Levi playing at their feet, Greta looked out at the land. The harsh, unforgiving soil had yielded a life more rich and full than she could ever have imagined. The cruel wager that had sent her into exile had led her home. Deacon put his arm around her, his touch solid and reassuring. Together, they watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, a promise of all the dawns yet to come.